Hey everyone, it's Carissa Wiley at sprinkledwithglitter.com. Thanks for joining me today. Today's video was previously shared on the Pinkfresh Studio YouTube channel, but I thought I would share it here because it's a fun summer project. Today I am sharing a bold and graphic, colorful card project featuring the Modern Rug Stencil set as well as the Hello Sunshine product suite, kind of some newer products mixed with some older products, and I'm going to share how you can do a little stencil layering to add a little more pattern to this Modern Rug Stencil set. Now it's a 5-piece stencil set, and you can see for a stencil set like this, it's very helpful to keep the packaging so that you can refer to it. Now, I'm using this very summery kind of rainbowy color palette here. I thought I might bring in passion fruit. I don't end up using it, but we're gonna start off with our Modern Rug Stencil set and we're gonna do some stenciling. So I have an A2 size panel of cardstock, white cardstock. This is my favorite blending cardstock. It is actually Concord and 9th white cardstock. It is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. Now, on each of these stencils, there is a number in the corner, and there are also registration marks. And since I am stenciling directly onto an A2 size panel of cardstock, I'm going to use those registration marks to line up with the corners of my cardstock. So those two little corner notches, those are going to go into the corner of my cardstock each time. Now, once I have stencil number 1 in place, you can see it's being held in place by a sticky mat. I am going to come in with Peach Fuzz ink. Now, I end up going back later and using Apricot ink instead of the Peach Fuzz ink because it needed a little more color, but you can see I'm just blending on that color. Then I'm bringing in stencil number 2 and I'm kind of referring to my packaging, and I'm bringing in Grassy Knoll ink for this one. Once again, I used those registration marks in the corner of the stencil to line those up with the corners of my A2 size panel of cardstock here. Now you can see that my ink blending looks a little splotchy, and that's okay because these Pinkfresh Studio inks are going to dry back and smooth out over time. So don't stress too much about how it looks now, but I do want you to pay attention to how it looks now versus how it looks when it dries back. So you can see I actually brought in key lime there because I wanted something a little darker for that green. And for stencil number 3, I am using Citron ink. I love Citron. This kind of yellowy green color is so bright and vibrant, perfect for summertime. And you'll see that I am working my way through my stencils, lining them up with the registration marks in the corner of the stencil. Now for stencil number 4, I'm using Ocean Breeze and I'm blending that onto my cardstock. And then for my final stencil, I am going to use Coral Reef. And the way I decided what colors I wanted to use was by referring to the packaging and just kind of determining what colors do I want next to each other, what color do I want more of, what color do I want less of, and also I kind of considered what color I wanted in the center as my focal point. And because I love Coral Reef so much, I saved the best for last. And I'm going to blend that on. Now for something like this, I prefer to use a larger blending brush because I'm covering larger areas of cardstock, but you could definitely use whatever blending brush or blending tool that you have. And you can see, as I mentioned before, it's not super smooth when you're looking at it here, but as it dries back, it's really going to smooth out and even out and give me a beautiful color. Now here is where I decided that that orange was not quite intense enough, so I placed stencil number 1 back over my cardstock, lining it up, and I came back in with Apricot to finish off my palette here. And with each stencil, I like to wipe it off before I remove it. It keeps everything a little bit cleaner, and you can see there is the finished design. Now, I want you to look at it here and then look at it a little bit later after it dries back. It's gonna smooth out, the colors are gonna soften, and it's really going to be beautiful. So after looking at this background, I decided that these florals stamped in a black and white design would probably be just fine. I don't need to bring more color into this card project. So I'm just going to take this 1-piece stamp from the Hello Sunshine stamp set, and I'm going to line it up on another panel of A2 size cardstock. This is white cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. You could stamp it on whatever size you want. But this is nice because it's a one-piece stamp, so I'm going to get all of these images in one stamping. I'm using the Detail Black Hybrid ink from Pinkfresh Studio to stamp these images. It's a nice, crisp black ink, but keep in mind it does take a little bit of time to dry because it's a hybrid ink. So you'll see that when I go to die cut my images, I actually use a piece of scrap paper to protect my plates because I don't want this ink to transfer to my cutting plates and then get on something else on my project later. So I'm using my Pinkfresh Studio stamp press tool to get even pressure all over these images, and I stamped them one more time for good measure, and now I'm removing those from my Misty stamping tool. And while I have this out, I'll bring in another scrap of white cardstock and the sentiment that says, "Hey Sunshine." I'm going to stamp it again in that Detail Hybrid ink onto this white cardstock, and then I'll be ready to kind of do all of my die cutting. So this says, "Hey Sunshine," which I thought was perfect for summertime, and this summertime palette just really brought this all together, and I love the way that this turns out with the crisp black and white images and sentiment against that really colorful, bold, geometric background. So now that my images are ready to go, I'm going to use the coordinating one-piece die. I'm going to line it up over this grouping of images. I'm using my Anna Griffin Impress machine, but you can use whatever die cutting machine you may have. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to cover this with a scrap piece of computer paper before I run it through my die cut machine so that I don't transfer any of that hybrid ink onto my cutting pad. It wasn't quite dry. Now, if you're concerned about that, another option would be to go ahead and hit this with a heat tool before you run it through your die cutting machine, and that will prevent that ink from transferring as well. So now I'm using the coordinating die to die cut the sentiment piece. I'm just kind of checking to see how much of that transferred. Not much of it transferred. It had kind of sat there on my desk for a minute, but I'm just using an abundance of caution because I don't want to redo these things today. Now, while I'm doing my die cutting, I'm going to cut that sentiment piece out of some plain white cardstock a couple more times to give it a little bit of weight and a little bit of heft. And this is when I decided to go back and add a little bit of pattern to my background. So I have stencil number 5 in place. That was the stencil that I used to do all of my coral reef blending. Now I've placed the border stencil right over the top of that, the part with the horizontal lines. And I'm inking with coral reef to give a tone-on-tone effect. And I just moved and shifted my stencil around to each of those areas with the coral reef ink and inked this striped pattern right on top. By layering up those stencils, it protected the surrounding colors and areas from that coral reef ink and allowed me just to blend those stripes onto the coral reef areas. So once again, I just replaced stencil number 5 over the stenciling I had already done, and then added my border stencil on top, inked the areas in coral reef ink for that tone-on-tone, and then I removed them both and I had that border stencil stenciled in the areas. Now, because the border stencil is very narrow, I did have to shift that stencil around to cover all of the areas, but I think that added bit of pattern is a really fun way to change up this modern rug stencil design. Now I have my background and I'm taking it over to my trimmer, and I'm using my trimmer just to cut out a rectangle from the center, and I'm using the pattern as a guide as to where to cut. So you can see I'm left now with 2 pieces of this background. I'm going to pop that center piece up to give it a little bit of dimension. Now, because my trimmer blade is not very sharp right now, I had some ragged edges on this cardstock. So I'm just taking a nail file, it's a really fine grit nail file, and going along the edges of my cardstock to remove some of those fuzzies that you can sometimes get when your blade isn't quite sharp enough. Another option would be to use a rectangle die to die cut the center. Now for my card base, I'm using a piece of white cardstock that measures 5.5 by 8.5 inches. I'm scoring it at 4 1/4, and then I am going to fold it over and reinforce that fold with my bone folder. Now, I always tell beginning card makers, one of the best things you can do to make your card look more finished is to score the crease. And I know that seems so simple, but it really does give a clean and finished look. You get less cracking, and your card bases just look, as I said, clean and finished. So now I am taking some tape runner adhesive and I'm adhering the outer part of my background on to my card base here. So this background is going to take up the entire card front, but I want this part to lay flat on my card base. So I'm just using tape runner adhesive for that. And for my center area, I cut a piece of gold cardstock that's just slightly larger than that center area to give it a little frame. But I didn't want this to kind of sag in the middle or have to kind of work around it. So I'm just inlaying a piece of white cardstock into that opening so that everything's nice and flat. Then I'm adhering the center panel onto that piece of gold cardstock with some foam adhesive. Then I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to add some tape runner adhesive on the back of this and add it into that space where I have that white cardstock. And that just keeps that gold cardstock from kind of sagging down in the middle so that everything's nice and flat. I'm working on a flat surface here to adhere this. Now I have my images that I've die cut out, these black and white images from that Hello Sunshine product suite. I think these are beautiful on their own, but of course there is a layering stencil set available if you wanted to add some color to your florals. I'm adhering this nice big floral piece to the bottom of that center area using some liquid glue. And these two leaves, I'm adding some foam adhesive to the back, but I'm also adding some liquid glue to the top of that foam adhesive so that I can kind of slide these around into place and not be super committed to where they land. Now you can see I also took my sentiment, I layered up those pieces of plain white die cuts behind it, and then I added a little strip of gold cardstock underneath it. I added some foam adhesive to that so that it has a little lift off of my card front, and now I'm adhering it onto the bottom, kind of in the center of this grouping, just keeping everything kind of nice and tight there in that lower left-hand corner. Now I'm going to finish off my card with some ice drops from Pinkfresh Studio. I'm using my dual-tipped embellishment tool and a little bit of liquid glue to place these onto my card. And that's going to finish off this bold, colorful, modern graphic card that's perfect for summertime. I love that layered stenciling with that little bit of pattern that's added to those coral reef areas. I think it's a fun way to kind of change this up, and you could do it to any area on this card background that you want. And you could try out a variety of patterns over your already stenciled area. So keep that in mind. This stencil layering technique is a great way to add just a little bit of pattern in some select places on your card. Now, as always, I will have links to the featured products used in this project in the description at YouTube. So if you're looking for something in particular, be sure you check there. Thank you so much for stopping by and watching today. I hope you enjoyed this project and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications here so you don't miss any of the fabulous paper crafting and card making video tutorials. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day.